Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Alexander Lashley. It's Not Just in Your Head is hosted by psychotherapist Dr. Harriet Frodd, addiction and substance misuse disorder counsellor Ikoi Hiro, and myself, editor and producer Liam Tate. This podcast is entirely funded by listeners, and as the famous meme states, we are critiquing capitalism because we are forced to participate in it in order to survive. So if you can afford to support the podcast, then your contribution will ensure that we can keep making this show. However, if you can't, then please just tell your friends about us, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, and YouTube.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
My name is Brian Pace, and I'm an affiliate scholar with the Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education out of the College of Social Work at The Ohio State University, where I am also a lecturer in the Department of Plant Pathology, also at OSU. I'm also the Politics and Ecology editor for Symposia, which is a 501c3 watchdog organization in the psychedelic and drug space.
So my name is Nishay Debenham, and then my background overlaps with Brian. So I'm a postdoctoral associate at the University of Cincinnati, but I'm also an affiliate scholar with the same Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education at OSU as Brian's affiliated with, where I also teach a class on psychedelic bioethics, and I also am a research fellow with Symposia.
Maybe we start from that place of like why maybe psychedelics have this reputation to begin with of somehow being aligned with progressive politics, and obviously why you guys maybe decided to sort of challenge that narrative.
Yeah, sure. As psychedelics become a topic of sort of dinner table conversation for a variety of reasons today, which dovetails with ongoing research for potential medical use, as well as policy shifts in places like Oregon and Colorado. The time at which psychedelics were of the topic of popular interest most recently was in the 60s and 70s, when just scores of people in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere were turned on, as they would say in the day, to LSD. You had people interested in psilocybin, and other compounds were becoming more commonly used psychedelic substances, and so that's when a lot of popular imagination has been attached to this era. This is when people who are like my mother's age and other people's grandmother's age of sort of younger generations have their memory and of the last like widespread use of substances like LSD, and that did coincide with social upheaval, with sort of discussions of revolution or progressive change for women, for homosexuals, for non-conforming gender identities, for different races. American Indian movement was popular in the early 70s and such. And so, you had psychedelic use in the mix, and I think a lot of people have a hard time, pulling them apart. And as we reevaluate psychedelics, the question is, well, did this play a role in that era? And if so, what was that role? So there's this assumption, that psychedelics are associated with sort of hippie aesthetic and sort of unifying visions of world peace and that kind of thing, but causation and correlation are two different things, basically. And there are other areas of human history where psychedelics were used where that same thing wasn't going on.
There can be consistent types of experiences, like a sense of connection, a unification, or a sense of questioning the status quo, but those can be interpreted in different ways. And you see this going on with like this conspirituality sort of movements in the present, where, just because you're questioning the dominant establishment or the way that things are with, the established culture, doesn't mean that has to be interpreted in a progressive direction. It can also go into a eco-fascist and authoritarian Nazi interpretations of the same kind of questioning that underlies that. And then just if I could do one more thing.
Oh, go on.
Oh, go ahead.
Please.
Well, just to get to the point about, why we decided this piece needed to come out. Part of it has to do with the ways that hype around psychedelic medicines have been mobilized in recent, just the past few years. It's gotten quite extreme. But we were seeing that a lot of corporate actors were citing the psychedelics make you more liberal and make you care for the other as reasons why they had to move as quickly as possible to get psychedelics into as many bodies as fast as possible around the world, because people were literally saying, CEOs and other people who were seeking to profit from psychedelic medicines were saying that this is literally essential for the continuing future of humanity on this planet, because they were saying psychedelics can help you care about climate change. They can help with political polarization. And so don't question how we're doing this rollout because, do you want to doom humanity? I mean, it's that I'm not even exaggerating that's how
right.
Some people were talking about it. And so our point is that it actually really matters how it's rolled out, and the way that it rolls out has a lot of implications for the impact on society and culture more generally.
I'm also of the era that, my beginnings of intense political activity were in the late 60s and early 70s. And our movement was really bifurcated. People who were interested in changing the look of reality through psychedelics were not the same people who were trying to change reality. And so that although we were in the same groups, the individuals were very divided, and between those who used their energy towards activism and those who used their energy towards changing the look of their own personal world, and therefore were not very active.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that, so just to be clear, one of the things that we sort of reassert while talking about psychedelics is that, it seems more likely that rather than pushing, individuals or groups of people towards some ideological pole or another as a result of the specific pharmacology of tryptamines or lysergamides or phenethylamines or what have you, that psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers of consciousness that are also radical experiences that can destabilize a person. Certainly a strong psychedelic experience can cause one to question one's place in the world, and this can be at times a revelatory and other times a traumatic experience, and that can be a pivot point for change downstream after a psychedelic experience. But that's really contingent which direction that change goes. Does somebody go a spiritual route? Do they decide that their marriage isn't working anymore? Do they change careers? That really is up to what kinds of support or lack thereof that they may have in their life, and viewed in this through this lens of a non-specific amplifier, and then looking back at some of the revolutionary amplification or intensification that seemed to happen during the 60s and 70s. It's really important to remember that the civil rights movement was a struggle that went back decades, but really had a lot of very, very strong organizational pushes in the 50s, and before the hippies, you had the Beats. So you had, I would say, rich soil for, what happened in that era when you added psychedelics. But it's not just like this simple put in drugs and get out environmentalists kind of equation.
Yeah, in fact, there was some fascinating stuff there about ecofeminism and deep ecology. I wondered maybe if you could talk about that self-other overlap, because it was a sort of pretty stark example of the hunter and the animal. And you were sort of using that as proof that this all sort of loving connection can be the idea of it sort of can be completely perverted, right?
Yeah. So I brought that that connection of the hunter in, but even though we were using the example of the hunter, you do see examples in like underground contexts where there's a shaman, for example, that will say to, people that they're working with that we're all one, but they feel like their role in the spiritual hierarchy means that their intuitions about what's right matter more even for you than your intuitions about what's right. So you see that language of we're all connected, I'm doing this in service, happening at the same time that people are using their power to instrumentalize others in ways that often look very much like they're using them for their own emotional, grandiose at times reasons, but they're using that language of connection. And connection to others can be a felt connection to one's place in the hierarchy. If you have this hierarchical view of the way that reality is structured, and then with figures like Jordan Peterson that we talk about in the paper, there are a lot of people who view society as hinging upon this very rigid hierarchy as this backbone that holds everything together and allows the good to exist. And so when you question that or challenge that hierarchy, it justifies all kinds of extreme retaliation because you're doing you view what you're doing is as best for everyone because you need to protect that central hierarchy. So the ways that all these ideologies map onto felt feelings of interconnection with others can look very different depending on what your ideological commitments are.
Right. And the relationship between the sort of hunter and the animal is not really about what the animal's experience is. It's sort of the animal's just instrumentalized as like, oh, by me killing you, I'm connecting with you because I'm better than you. That was the vibe, right? In its most simplest.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I was just going to say, a big part of psychedelic history that goes beyond, modern use is Aztec and Mayan, very organized rituals that did include, great familiarity with a number of psychedelics and also human sacrifice. And so these kinds of traditions were a very deep kind of interconnection with trying to placate deities and continue the furtherance of the universe. So it can look a lot of different ways.
Yeah, the stuff about Jordan Peterson talking about his hierarchies and, I guess his attempt to naturalize them by saying hierarchies are good because they're based on competency, dispensing life advice and addicted to benzos. It's like, is the competent hierarchies thing true?
I would just comment. Actually, there's a recent Scientific American article saying the role of luck in life success is far greater than we realized. I mean, this putting everything on competence, putting everything, as Jordan Peterson likes to do, on individual IQ, and that IQ is this perfect test that then predicts one's success in life. Completely removing the history of that test as a metric for eugenicists to do eugenics. It makes this a very clean worldview that people on the right where hierarchies are shored up and justified. Powerful people are powerful because they are either divinely chosen or in Peterson's view of the world are at the height of the meritocracy. And that's very convenient if you are not somebody who is being exploited actively.
Yeah, it's also beginning to crumble in the United States, particularly because the great geniuses like Elon Musk turns out to be a fool, as well as Trump, who called himself a stable genius and is a fool, and also Sam Bankman-Fried of the cryptocurrency. So this idea of the ultimate merit of success has been dealt a serious blow.
And just to add another point about Jordan Peterson, he's one thing that Brian and I, our work has continued to track is the ways that psychedelic researchers have been pretty enthusiastic about going on to Jordan Peterson's podcast. So we in the paper talked about Roland Griffiths, who was the kind of, I believe, the first researcher who did this, but there have been at least 2 others since then. And psychedelics have come up in even more podcasts than that. And it's slightly just concerning just in terms of the ways that the researchers, don't seem to have any kind of critical view of the ways that Jordan Peterson's hierarchy-based ideology can map onto psychedelics. And specifically, I've been interested in looking at, the ways that Jordan Peterson has been championing, so-called conversion therapy for gender and sexual minorities, given the fact that his broader ideology talks about that the gender hierarchy is one of those pinnacles of what holds society together. And he views transgenderism as a kind of, a virus, a mind virus that is kind of infecting people and culture and undermining that central hierarchy. And you're combining that interest with psychedelics that are known to, or at least, talked about in terms of being able to change people's sense of self and personality. And there's just a lot concerning to me about bringing those threads together.
Particularly with the history of psychedelics being used in conversion therapy or attempts at conversion therapy in the past. This is not a good combination. I also just would want to point out, and I need to say this because it really is disappointing when groups of people who, will say we need psychedelics to save the world, or maybe more narrowly, we need psychedelics to treat people's mental health distress, be it post-traumatic stress disorder or major depressive disorder or addiction to substance use disorders. And when you look at these different categories of mental health distress, the kinds of people who are more susceptible to them are often gender minorities, people who are trans, exactly the targets of Dr. Peterson. And not only that, but there are people who identify this way who are, interested in the field, who are active researchers in the field. And frankly, I just see this kind of association with this open bigot to be a betrayal of the idea that these substances are to be used in a healing fashion.
Yeah.
That's kind of capitalism, though, isn't it?
Jordan Peterson has a huge audience. He has an audience of millions. And so certainly some career-minded individuals in this space have done the math and said, well, we can make an exception.
But I think tools kind of being co-opted by mendacious, individuals or entities or systems is par for the course in our society. I don't think psychedelics are necessarily any different.
I agree with Ikoy because I also think it's essentialist to think that any substance has a social meaning. It depends on how it's used. Nothing has an essential political direction if it's a plant or a chemical. Everything is social context. And I think that's something that capitalism denies, but of course it's true.
For example, methamphetamine and methamphetamine users get an extraordinarily stigmatized slander in society that, for example, psychedelics don't necessarily get, and again, a lot of these have a lot more to do with stigma in society than the actual substance. Yeah. So in many ways, I feel like, somebody that is interested in the medical application of a lot of, what were formerly, or now becoming legalized substances, whether that's cannabis or whether that's psilocybin or any of the ibogaine, et cetera, et cetera. I do think the research on that end is extremely interesting and possibly, important in terms of offering better treatment for people. But, any strong substance has potential negative outcomes. substances are essentialized in many ways. So like,
Yes.
if you take mushrooms, you're going to be a better person. If you take meth, you're going to be a worse person. If you take heroin, you're going to, there are so many essentialism that is attached to substances that is unwarranted, because a lot of how human behavior is shaped is social. Like, it's not that, if you are in a certain social environment, can substances potentially help? For example, like, psilocybin can it maybe help people? Sure, but it's also like the trip that you have, is a limited time, and then you are back to your normal environment.
I mean, there is a prominent researcher in the psilocybin world who is running around saying that psilocybin makes nicer people. That's a direct quote. So, I mean, these are areas of contention where people who are researchers in this space, who are helping craft media narratives, are making assertions. And the reason why we put this paper together really wasn't that like a bunch of people think that if you take psychedelics you're going to buy a Volvo and listen to jam bands, but it's that in neuroscience, peer-reviewed publications were putting out a very similar narrative, saying that psilocybin or classical psychedelics in general were going to reduce authoritarianism, we're going to increase liberalism, we're going to increase nature relatedness, and in combination with the fertile soil of that media narrative that we've been referencing, or that cultural picture we have of who is a psychedelic user, combined in such a way that was really pushing a broad, I would say, utopian idea of what a broad adoption of psychedelics might do. And as Dr. Devenot was referring to earlier, this is a narrative that is absolutely being embraced and taken advantage of and gestured to by, profit-driven corporadelic actors, as we call them. They're gesturing at these kinds of narratives and these studies, and they're using them as what in sort of more technical propaganda speak is called a glittering generality. And, come try psychedelics and this will be your contribution to building a better world.
Right. I mean, that's boilerplate marketing in some ways.
Yes, it is. And it's using people's hopes for a better world as a, tool to hustle something, to profit. Right.
And in this case, it's, the majority of the most prominent, if not all, of the most prominent scientists working in the field of psychedelic science and medicine are getting paid, have some kind of financial conflict of interest associated with corporations that are trying to build out these medicines. So there's a tight kind of overlap between the way that scientists are framing what psychedelics do and, the interests of these larger corporate actors. And it also, when you have groups like the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, the executive director of that organization, has been forthright about his belief that it's not just a scientific or medical mission, it's a spiritual mission, securing the spiritual future of humanity. And then the other researcher that Brian mentioned, talking about how psychedelics make you better people, it also contributes to a lack of criticality around the potentials for harms and abuse to go on with psychedelics. Because if you think that psychedelics, someone who's used a lot of psychedelics as your guide, they must have worked through their stuff and be a good person, but we know that that's not the case.
No, it's parallel to psych drugs being hustled as if they bring healing when they don't. They can alleviate symptoms, usually by numbing people, but they certainly can never heal you in and of themselves. But that's how they're hustled, just the way join the Nike revolution. My God, buying sneakers makes a revolution, but they use people's aspirations for change as a marketing tool, as Ecoy says.
Yeah, and I also think that in your paper you show that there's an intense amount of venture capital money that's backing a lot of this stuff. So again, the idea that this is going to be the source of any sort of systemic change, like individually, that's from the stuff that I've seen elsewhere. I mean, you mentioned Carhart Harris and his work,
yes,
whose stuff I've followed for a long time, and I've watched the documentary, one of the documentaries they made following, severely depressed patients and their use of psilocybin to kind of lift some of that stuff and the successes or not, I guess, that went along with that. And so from an individual perspective, there's definitely something going on where it can alleviate suffering. So that's all good. And I don't think you're really sort of going after that. I think you're just making the point that essentially don't believe the hype. And also, not only just don't believe the hype, this stuff is like you say, it's an amplifier, but it's incredibly potent. And I think maybe the thing that makes psychedelics different from other medication is the sense of, it absolutely does change your reality, at least for a time. And I don't know, did other substances sort of really make you that vulnerable in the sense that your sensory perception is just blown up, really, isn't it? So I think psychedelics do have the patient is going to be in more vulnerable state with psychedelics than any other substance. Is that hyperbolic or is that true?
I don't think it's untrue.
I don't think it's untrue, but I also don't think. I think vulnerability is a lot more than. I mean, it's a complex interplay of various factors of which substances can take part.
Yeah, I think some of there's with something like opiates where you can become vulnerable because if you're just non-responsive and literally vulnerable to whatever's going on around you and not able to react the way that you would ordinarily, there's that kind of vulnerability. But I think with psychedelics, there's a fairly unique sense of vulnerability in the sensitivity to set and setting, the context that you're in, and the heightened suggestibility. So it's like, you're oftentimes like more porous to what's going on around you, the people that you're with, the ideas that you have been exposed to in that moment, or, in the time leading up to that moment, that can make you more impressionable, than you would ordinarily.
Take William Watson, for example. So William Watson was arrested at the Capitol. He was pictured next to the Q shaman, and he was out on bail for $106,000. The government had caught him with about 4 grams of LSD. He said that he came to the Capitol because he was listening to Alex Jones, and Alex Jones said, "Come on down." So, I mean, here's a guy who's definitely, has access to quite a bit of LSD, listening to some sort of demagogue, and it translated into, action there. Now, it's usually not, I mean, the CIA spent quite a bit of time and effort trying to instrumentalize psychedelics into a brainwashing tool. And so it's not as linear as you might think, but people becoming vulnerable to things like stochastic terrorism, where if you listen to Alex Jones and you listen to other kinds of extremists, eventually you'll do something that these people are hinting at should be done. And whether or not psychedelics might play a role in that, I think is a very individual kind of thing. I'm not saying that if you take psychedelics you're going to become a Manchurian candidate or anything like that, but they're destabilizing experiences in a person's life. And when somebody's life or worldview is destabilized, that means that another one may be adopted, and that's going to be based on whatever is available.
There's something in hypnosis called the confusion technique, that if you want someone to believe something, you do some very confusing things first and then give them something solid, and whatever it is, they'll hold on to it for the solidity.
Right.
And
Wow.
I should mention too that the suggestibility is explicitly part of how a lot of the psychedelic medicine, the thinking about why the therapy is working is that, people are in an altered state and potentially kind of taking up therapeutic suggestions and kind of new perspectives on their lives in a way that they might be more, slow to or more resistant to in ordinary consciousness. So suggestibility is part of how psychedelic medicine is kind of being rolled out in terms of the therapy, but it also opens the door for all kinds of, bad actors to come in. And this is something I've talked about in my work where, we know from other contexts that people who have a personality drive to exert power and control over others will often create life circumstances where they have access to people that they can abuse, whether that's, the Boy Scouts or the Catholic Church or an Olympic gymnastics team. People will create life situations like that. So when you have the kind of vulnerability and suggestibility that people have on psychedelics, where you need to expect that there's going to be people coming into those contexts that don't necessarily have just the healing of the person in mind.
Particularly in a capitalist society, as Ecoy said before, where profit is the motive for an enormous amount of life for people.
I mean, it's a very ripe, well, I think therapy in general oftentimes is a very ripe field for mendacious actors. And I see that as somebody in mental health. And I think, powerful tools because, MDMA is another, I think MDMA is actually probably even a stronger empathogen in some ways than psilocybin. But these are powerful tools, and powerful tools, do require a certain level of sobriety and caution that I think is getting blown to the wind in some ways. But I think to a certain degree, like a huge aspect of like the psilocybin and the psychedelic market is probably going to follow a certain trajectory very similar to the cannabis market in its legalization and profitization.
In terms of profit and the profit motive and how that's impacting the landscape of how psychedelics are being talked about, one of the things that I touch on in my other work is, essentially there's this bait and switch going on where we know that the kind of arbitrary extreme inequality in terms of material resources that, came up earlier in talking about people like Bankman-Fried and Elon Musk, that it's actually that inequality that is driving things like political polarization and climate change. And yet here are these capitalists that are saying, don't address that underlying inequality in society, just take this pill and that's going to solve those problems, when actually they're trying to create yet another unicorn company of psychedelic medicine and fueling the very inequality that's actually contributing to those problems.
We note in the paper that Christian Angermeyer, who's one of the biggest investors in the psychedelic space, chairman of Atai Life Sciences, he was quoted on an interview in CNBC as saying the world we're building is a bad place for our brain, so mental health issues will go up. But I think we have some real shots in our portfolio to end the mental health crisis. So he's talking about psilocybin and and other psychedelics and therapy, and the way that I have conceptualized this for myself is that the big investment coming into psychedelics is as being an intervention for the ennui of the current moment of worker instability, climate anxiety. This is like an antibiotic being dripped into a factory farmed distressed animal just to keep it going. The SSRIs, the other kinds of mainstream mental health interventions, like people are looking for psychedelics because they're not giving necessarily the relief that they'd like, and it may be that something like joining a union is going to improve somebody's life on a material basis more than any novel mental health intervention.
It may also, since it connects people with common needs, it may also help people psychologically a lot more than psilocybin would, because one of the things that happens when you join a union, you become connected with something bigger than yourself and other people involved in a bigger dream and a bigger reality, and also based in material betterment for workers versus employers, and a sort of incipient recognition of class injustice between an employer class and an employee class. So on all of those levels, it looks superior.
Yeah, but you don't see colors. You don't go, you don't shoot off out your own body into space. So
No, you don't.
I disagree with you, Harriet.
Well, I think the issue here is, if we are going to talk about the focus of fix yourself, not the world. That's the entire therapy
Yes.
in the United States, at least. Constantly in drug treatment, because drug treatment is fundamentally based on the 12 steps, which is, made famous by Alcoholics Anonymous, is the most, famous 12 step, right? But, a huge part of the first tenet of 12 steps is that you are absolutely helpless and that you need to give yourself over to a higher power. Right? Like these kinds of thinking is endemic in our mental health treatment.
It is, but the contradiction is that I think where the 12-step programs work is because it's a communist program in a capitalist society. It's from each according to his ability or her ability to each according to his or their needs. And there's no money in it. And everyone is accepted and struggle with support of other people.
Kind of.
I think the parallel, which is interesting in what you're talking about with AA, is it sounds very similar to what was mentioned earlier about the idea of the shaman sort of being at the top of the ceremony, like I'm the one in charge. Because you've spoken previously about how AA can be a site of abuse because, just the small interactions between other people, there becomes a hierarchy in that. And if you are existing in that sort of situation where you have to give up and say you're powerless, whilst other people are sort of taking digs at you. I found, generally speaking, the whole idea that psychedelics have the power to naturalize hierarchy being the most disturbing. And I think that does have, like I said, I think that has parallels with the AA thing. It's like, give yourself up. You're weak. You need us kind of thing.
Right. And that's kind of how our whole mental health structure is built on. A huge aspect of therapy is often, I can't tell you the number of people that go to therapists that start talking about the best way to help the world is to help myself. That is one of the biggest takeaways that a lot of people take from therapy. And by all means, if you are completely dysfunctional, then, it is important to become functional so that you can be part of the greater community. But, people in the United States oftentimes are taking a very different message.
They are, because it's the overweening ideology of our country is capitalism, where you are looking to profit yourself and make more while the people who work for you make less to advance yourself. But I do think that even though I do find AA too God-ridden, you can think of, particularly in adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional parents, the solidarity of the group replaces the individual family. And the spiritual connection can be the higher power of us all working together, or God. And so that it's a step away from the individual consumption model, since money is not part of it and solidarity is, even though it isn't inflected that way.
Well, it's certainly true that psychedelics are being positioned as an individual cure for what, should be better understood as systemic problems. And that is ultimately one of the ways that we wrapped up the paper, is pointing out that this is not exactly, this doesn't bear out when you try it. Systems are bigger than any individual. And it's not to say that individuals can't affect systemic change, but yeah, if you're looking to have more of an effect, addressing systems is more bang for your buck.
Yes, and I think that psychological realization should be part of every movement, that we need each other to improve our personal and our political and our planetary lives, which it has been lacking. And that's a lot of people look to therapy because they don't understand the collective benefit of connection.
Can I just ask, as a sort of laying it out, I think it probably has been touched upon, but I just want to make sure that maybe I've got it on audio, is exactly how the process of sort of naturalizing hierarchy happens. Like, there's, from what I can remember on my notes, it's like that during this sort of peak moment of vulnerability that you sort of have a gratitude for the authority in your presence, right? And that then creates the obedience. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't necessarily always need to happen, I think, in the same way. So I think gratitude for just like feeling a small part of something larger can kind of slide into feeling that something larger is kind of more important than you. And then, if that is a authoritarian leader, then you might kind of, whatever that person wants, you might justify behaving in that way. And it can, so all of the emotions that are usually associated with awe, or including awe and gratitude, and this sort of sense of smallness in light of a kind of cosmic big thing, all of that can be leading towards an interpretation of equality and like every little thing matters in a way that's not rigidly hierarchical or based on, I think it needs to kind of connect with some pre-existing ideological sense of a more rigid hierarchy to go in that direction. I mean, because a lot of times, what we're seeing is it's not just like people have never considered hierarchy before, and then they have a psychedelic experience and they feel like hierarchy makes sense, but that they've had these ideas in their lives and their culture, and then those feelings connect to that sense of just everything is, I enjoy kissing the boot of this larger force, I mean, I'm, phrasing it in a silly way, but that's, basically it can go in either direction. The same phenomenological and emotional stuff can be interpreted in those different ways.
This is a common mistake, in therapy, where a person can have sort of a dangerous sort of transference where they begin to attribute the skill of the therapist for work that they did themselves, for improvement that they have. And this is something that can be heightened in a psychedelic situation where, psychedelics are not exactly accessible to everyone. The medical model, the experimental model that's currently with us now, the medical model that's emerging, is where you have experts, you have some bureaucratic, like hoops to go through, and all of that is a part of the set and setting of the experience. What are we communicating in that moment? Well, we're saying that these are very special tools that very special people are going to be meeting out, and that's a sort of a somewhat disempowering setup. And I'm encouraged by some of the decriminalization efforts, namely Measure 110, which was statewide in Oregon, that actually decriminalized that addressed all drugs and moved to a more Portuguese model. But by sort of lifting up medical authority in that way, we're creating a framework that that funnels access through that one route, and that can have funny effects.
Maybe this is a more sort of philosophical question, but I was watching a Big Think YouTube video about psychedelics, and he was saying, some other stuff that you come across, like, one dose of psilocybin is like the equivalent of 1,000 hours of therapy, that kind of stuff, right? And he was giving the example of people, it had provided relief to cancer patients, that they I guess maybe lifted a fear of dying, but it was also this thing of that, you know, I'm still here, I'm still alive, so I can enjoy this time, etc. And they sort of knew that in words, but it was the drugs that helped them actually feel that concept. And that is kind of interesting, because something that was mentioned earlier is that idea of, in this sort of vulnerable state where you have some sort of gratitude, or there's this sort of emotional connection, I assume, to some sort of like emotional core, that when people have these sort of overwhelming experiences, oftentimes it's to some degree not really describable, but there's a feeling that they know, right? There's no doubt that comes with it. Maybe a year or so ago, we had a guest who had been on benzodiazepine for 10 years. And she sort of spoke about her process of what it was to come off of that drug. And she spoke about some sort of semi-religious out-of-body experiences she had, you know, and they're her experiences, and she feels it, and that's real to her. But what occurred to me after the recording of that is that, you know, if you go actually meet the devil, you know, for this person, that was completely true. And I was like, well, this is the power of, you know, any sort of huge emotional experience, is that because you felt it, it's 100% real. But the need for doubt is probably the most sort of fundamentally sort of important thing you could probably possess as a human, right? Because it's really unsettling in some ways, because all the things that you take for granted because you know them, because you feel them, might actually be complete bollocks.
Yes, very important, that critical distance.
Right. It allows for due diligence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Shayla Love, who actually wrote that the Vice piece that mentioned our paper, she's also written on a different paper or a different article on Vice about how insights that can feel very real and true and unquestionable can be illusory, you know. And so the question then becomes, in some cases, the sense of being connected to something larger than yourself, and that you can die and the world will go on, and, you know, but you're connected to that larger ongoing thing that is the universe, can be very you know, have a huge impact on life experience, quality of life. And, you know, but if you're that unshaking doubt of connecting to something larger is like the Aryan race, and, you know, then you kind of go along with the Nazi kind of project in Germany, it can lead in a very different direction, but it can be a kind of similar core experience of this unshaking connection to something larger. And just in terms of my own experience, I mean, the reason I got involved in the field is I had a psychedelic experience many years ago that addressed this deep-seated, and I would say pathological, anxiety about death that affected, you know, all kinds of walks of my life. And it was just something that was constantly plaguing me. And I had this experience where I just felt connected to something bigger, and I watched snow kind of melting into the ground and disappearing, and then just seeing the water seep into the ground and kind of continue in a new form. And it totally transformed my anxiety. Like after that, this plaguing fear that I'd had since childhood didn't recur in the same way. So it's like I can see how that can go in a very, you know, therapeutically positive direction, but that same underlying experience can also go in a direction that can be pathological, antisocial, and harmful.
Absolutely. Similarly, I've been benefited by my own experiences with psychedelics, but I've also had some experiences that have been fundamentally unmooring and have led me down, you know, paranoid routes as a younger person. And that can happen when you have such radical experiences that you begin to question how reality works, you know, and that's not something that everybody is equipped to deal with, that we have a good you know, discussion about, especially, you know, at times when psychedelics were not just illegal but also taboo. It doesn't help things, you know, that these radical experiences are unsupported, and so I generally think that more discussion about psychedelics is good, I'm currently an educator teaching about psychedelics to undergraduates, and I feel that I get to be, somebody that I probably could have used earlier in my life, and that's gratifying. But your mileage may vary, is the big takeaway here.
Right. I mean, that's to a certain degree, like the issues that plague psilocybin and all the psychedelics are similar to issues that plague a lot of drugs in general, right? Is that, there is a huge overhype that doesn't necessarily commiserate with reality and individual experience. Oftentimes in the hype, because that's one of the issues about like a lot of drug talk, right? Is that, the negatives are often so emphasized that, it's also like, so it becomes like, a lot of issues where you have two extremes and very little of content of, broad diverse content. You just have like, one side that is pro and one side that is anti, battling it out.
Rather than a non-essentialist view that these drugs don't have anything in and of themselves. Depends on the context and the use and the person.
The trouble is that an essentialized view is quite common in psychedelic advocates and in researcher spaces, and that these are the people who are being centered in a broad social conversation about what to do with psychedelics, and some of the tactics, some of the open tactics that are being used, like for instance, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Study has been actively cultivating right-wing politicians and cultural figures to make a play at some sort of psychedelic bipartisanship. And we've stated elsewhere, really, that this kind of play, it makes perfect sense if you're the sort of person who believes that psychedelics will essentially make you a better, kinder, more spiritual, more cooperative human, and that in this way that maybe we're just getting one over on these people who are interested in supporting psychedelic research because it might help veterans deal with their PTSD, and it's just this sort of strange calculus that is unfolding in front of us, to the point where one of the researchers that we were critiquing in right-wing psychedelia, which would be Robin Carhart Harris. We're talking about his research in the paper. We're talking about Jordan Peterson. Recently, Robin Carhart Harris went on Jordan Peterson's podcast, and his discussion of the matter online on Twitter was like, I think, he was like, I hope I don't get canceled for this, or something to that effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just on that point about fears about the kind of, or needing to compensate for how psychedelics had been thought of so negatively for so many years by popular culture. It's been tricky for us working in the field. I've been working in the field of psychedelics since 2010, so longer than most of the current researchers who are involved in the space have been here. And yet, Ryan and I and our colleagues have been, in many cases, marginalized from the kind of dominant discourse around psychedelics because we're seen as threatening it's been so long for psychedelics to be taken seriously, and to have these kind of more critical conversations might jeopardize, all that's been developed. But in our perspective, it's important to take a more nuanced stance at this early stage, because the longer we go about ignoring the potential for harms and for problems, they're going to happen increasingly more as more and more people are getting involved in psychedelics and in these spaces. So it's not, we can hold both things at the same time. We can say psychedelics have a lot of amazing potential, and we are, think they're fascinating and interesting and deserve to be studied. And there are all these ways that things can go wrong, especially if you're not keeping your, your guard up about them.
Yeah, and Dr. Deveneaux is putting it lightly. We have not just been marginalized. We were outright banned from attending Wonderland Miami just recently. So certainly some of the things that we have been putting on the table in culture and interviews in the peer-reviewed literature is threatening to some of these folks out there.
Well,
Right.
you made a wonderful mistake, Brian, when you said culting and then cultivating, because there,
I wrote that down. I thought it was
Lisa Bieberman, who was a researcher back in the 60s, coined a term called cultigens to describe psychedelics. And I think there's probably
Whoa.
something to it.
Clearly, there will be massive blowback if there's no sort of critical take on this stuff, in 10 years' time. You do is sort of point out that because clients would be in a potentially super vulnerable position, it's like ripe for all kinds of abuse, therapy abuse.
It is.
Yeah, very dangerous.
So one of the things that we're like concerned with, and when we spoke more thoroughly on this topic at the University of Madison, how we concluded things was to point out that psychedelic, mega churches, some sort of psychedelic prosperity gospel, there's no real barrier for that to occur, particularly when we're moving towards a situation where institutional sanction of either psychedelic medicine or psychedelic spirituality with psychedelic chaplaincy, it removes the sort of obey the laws of Caesar kind of thinking that keep evangelicals away from using drugs. Once they become institutionally sanctioned, they will become kosher to mix my metaphors here. And if that happens, there's no reason why they will not be incorporated into the American style, prosperity gospel, evangelical kind of big box church movement.
As long as that is there,
some of this is already happening.
Capitalist culture, it will be taken advantage of. That's why that culture has to change.
I also think it just has to be said, because I forgot to mention it. You made this brilliant point just in the sort of footnotes of one of the pages, the overview effect in space.
Yeah. Well, we were writing this paper, around the time where Jeff Bezos, was going into space, and there was a lot of parallel conversation happening around, the idea of the overview effect, which draws from past generations of astronauts going into space and then having a kind of unitive, mystical type experience when they see kind of how small and precious the world is and how everyone's kind of connected on this pale blue dot floating in space. And then a lot of people, when Jeff Bezos was going into space, were saying, oh, he's going to have this overview effect experience, and then he's going to want to use his money for good, and it's going to change things. And so, yeah, but it's interesting, since that happened, there's also been William Shatner went up.
I was just going to mention it.
Yeah, because it just shows how things can go in different directions. Because, Brian, do you want to describe William Shatner?
Yeah, well, William Shatner went up and he had an overview effect, but it was profoundly depressing to him. And he said all of this effort going into the space program, this is the Star Trek guy, he then said, we should be, he had an overview effect. He said, we should be taking care of what's happening on Earth. But the result for him personally was deep depression.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it was actually kind of a touching, I didn't expect that speech from William Shatner, the person, but I found his commentary on his experience of going into space kind of touching.
So Bezos was there just kind of like partying and grabbing a champagne and like spraying it, when I think Shatner was even like doesn't drink. And it was just the contrast in terms of like it's clear that type of going out and having that view of the Earth doesn't lead to a consistent outcome for people. And
Exactly.
that Bezos hasn't fundamentally questioned the ordering of capitalism and society or any of that.
Right, because his insight was like, let's build all the polluting factories in space. Right, that's his big overview effect. It wasn't like let's all treat the world better or other people. And the other thing is also that the overview effect presumably came to be a term because all these NASA astronauts went into space. And if you
Correct.
think about the set and setting, they're a government agency. They were doing something, for their nation, as it were.
Right.
So it
Getting
kind of,
ready to have bases on.
well,
moon.
it's that whole thing about like being part of something bigger, whether that's a good or bad thing. I think
Yeah.
in some ways this conversation has revealed that, like, just
Yes.
because you're part of something bigger doesn't mean it's great, right? You could be with the Nazis, you might be with a union, who knows, but the point being that I wonder if that was part of why there was that idea that, if you have the overview effect, it will be great, is because it was all coming from and being experienced by people who were NASA astronauts involved in something bigger. Whereas the whole Bezos thing is about like, here's an individual who did it, not a group, it's just me.
Liam,
Right.
I think that's an interesting point, particularly because we're at an inflection point where, the truth is like something like 20% of Americans have had some lifetime experience with psychedelics, like across the board. It's less for specific ones like LSD. It's closer to 10%. But I mean, I think that, the things that we're talking about with not just psychedelic medicalization, but with decriminalization, is that psychedelics will become much more available to the average person on the street, which means not just one experience, but perhaps a dozen people getting a chance to really explore and experiment with them. And just like you were saying about, perhaps we think of the overview effect because of the subset of people who had it first. I think that one of the things that we try to trouble is the idea that, like, look at the demographics of people who have taken psychedelics. Of that 20%, the majority of them, something like 85%, are white men.
Yeah.
And not only white men, but usually white men with some college education. A lot of people, encounter drugs because they went to where people are able to obtain them. So maybe that's college, maybe that's the rave scene, maybe it's Burning Man. But these are very particular funnels, and as a broader group of people become exposed to these consciousness shifting substances, a lot of our assumptions about what kinds of experiences they're generally going to produce may shift.
Well, I think it's really important what you've done, because you show that what you do when you introduce something new is you introduce something new to enhance or to exploit human beings. And both possibilities are there.
Yeah. I guess we have to wrap this up, but yeah, I definitely fall into that category of being a white dude who essentially was a narco tourist, right? Because I was that prick who went to South America and had like a whole bunch of ayahuasca sessions, and it was a very, it was interesting, not what I expected. It was profound in some ways, but I just absolutely did not like the situation. I absolutely shut it down.
The set and setting was not proper for you.
No, and the reason I did it, it's kind of interesting. If you talk about this future where potentially I might be able to, I'm not in America, but in a situation where Britain legalizes a bunch of these things, or at least decriminalizes, whatever. In that situation, having access to psychedelics, like the reason I went over there was like, well, at least people know what they're doing. If I just sort of do it with a mate, who knows what the fuck could happen, right? It's just slight paranoia on my part. But when I went over there, you were with a group of like 10 or 20 other people, and you've got the shaman and the assistant and all this sort of stuff. And it just felt like, at that time in particular, it was great because it's like, people having all these spacey conversations. Normally everyone's talking business, back home. So it was really great. But within 24 hours, I was like, man, these people are crazy. And I just didn't sort of trust the process or the experience. I mean, in the end, I had some sort of nice feelings, I guess, towards some family and friends. And there was definitely that sort of sense of connection or love to them, but not to anyone else in that room. I just absolutely didn't trust them. So it's quite interesting reading, because I always went away from that sort of experience somehow a sense of maybe like I failed something, but in reading your paper, I felt a bit better about myself, because I was like, no, I absolutely didn't trust any of them, and I was looking after myself. And given that, you sort of make this point about in that vulnerability, you can sort of succumb to sort of gratitude or obedience. Like, yeah, it's so funny because I hadn't put it in those terms, but there was absolutely this sense that everyone loved the shaman, and it was just like, screw this guy and screw all these people.
Yeah, good for you.
Yeah. So, but it was serious. Like, one dude started coughing up blood, and they were just like, "Oh yeah, don't worry about it." And it's just like, what the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah.
That's concerning.
Yeah,
that's really concerning.
It's a medical issue.
It is concerning, and and that seems to be a big thing in the ayahuasca. Sorry, Ikwe.
Oh yeah, no, it's. I mean, a lot of these quote unquote tourisms really don't do a lot of medical background checks and screening.
Well, also when you really think about it, it's all a bit gross. It's like I'm a white dude flying into a culture that I don't understand, taking in a ritual that I don't understand. It's all just a bit like,
I mean, but
it's complicated.
I don't think that's limited to that kind of tourism. I think that's for most people, tourism is about novelty and experience, not actually taking in a culture.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm aware that sort of self-indulgent detour was possibly unnecessary, but it's more just as sort of
it's interesting.
I'm very grateful for the paper and the work that you're both doing.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you for the conversation. I'm really glad the piece could be useful, and we're always happy to connect with people to think through what are ultimately very complex and nuanced ideas. So thank you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks for reaching out to us.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons: Rebecca Johns, Bruce Rogers Vaughan, Alexander Lashley, Sheena Belmas, Seamus O'Connell, Alex Placito, and Wig Shaker.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.